my glasses and can't see anybody. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank, everybody had been thanked already. But again, Linda, one of the things I found early on was my students were really special people, and you've been introduced to a number of them here today. And I've always appreciated my students, and in many different ways. We go on field trips, and some of the graduates would host our classes, and we went this type of thing as well. But this is an amazing event. I did put together a whole series of notes here. Most of these have already been covered, which is wonderful. Actually, I want to go back to the very beginning for just a minute. And that is, we came in January of 1966. The landscape architecture program had begun in the fall of '65. I came to teach the plant materials courses and to help to design the various courses for the program as it evolved. I taught many of them once, and then we found somebody that could do it better. But I only, the one course I never let go to anybody else until I retired was the plants courses. And I really have enjoyed those. One of the wonderful things, not many people can say this, that their hobby is also their profession. And with me, that's plant materials. I've enjoyed propagating, growing, giving them away, developing this. And it's wonderful to be able to say that my work and my hobby are all one. And so many people are doing other things just so that they can do their hobbies. Well, I just do it all the time. When I started teaching, I had realized there were some issues I had to figure out how to deal with. One happened 6 months after I came. I got a call from the person who was head then of what was the University Arboretum, saying, come get any plants you want. We're losing, we're losing an area, and the area that is now the Coliseum and the natatorium and the parking lots had been taken away from the Arboretum, and they had lots of plantings and a pond and that sort of thing there. And being new, I didn't know what to do with it. So but that gave me a clue that, okay, the university, watch out. I also discovered that I had more books on plants and landscape architecture in my personal library than they had in the university library. And so one of my jobs was to prepare hundreds of requisitions for books that we needed to add to the library. And I had a funny experience one time. Some of you might not understand this, but I'll explain it. Jack Paulus, who was chair at the time, came up to me and said, I wonder if you could explain this requisition to me. And it was for a book called Mammillaria. You thought I'd gone over the edge. I said, no, that is a genus of cactus. Never know. The other thing I had to deal with is teaching plants. I like to teach the plants as real live things, not just as pictures. I heard many comments from students who took the course, The Flora of West Virginia by Dr. Earl Core. He used pictures. And of course, he gave quizzes from pictures. And they had problems because they, might have a little bitty flower like that, but on the screen it was like that, and they'd have problems with that. So I like to take the classes out and show them the plants and get to know them in the out of doors whenever we had nice weather. But I found very quickly there wasn't that much on campus to look at. So I went to the University Arboretum and found that they've got a nice collection there, but it's primarily, their focus is on native plants. And I like to think more in the range of ornamentals, other things that would be useful to people in West Virginia. And another thing, particularly at the time, you go to a garden center or something, and they were bringing in plants from Florida and California and trying to sell them here, and they wouldn't go through the first winter. And so to be able to have a place to show people what we can actually grow here was another one of my goals. But because of that, we invaded people's yards. How many of you have had my class in your yard? Yeah, many of you, yes, I know. That was, and I can tell you tons of stories about that. And the thing is, I found, people, the students, as we go, they would be hesitant to go into anybody's yard. And I said, no, one of the things I have found is that if you're looking at plants, it's all right. They were concerned about trespassing. I said, no, if you're looking at plants, it's okay. And basically, in all my years, I was only yelled at 3 times. One of them was by a fellow I knew, and I think he was just harassing me just to be that way. Another one was the fellow, we were in this, we'd step one step off the sidewalk to look at this plant, and the neighbor came over, and it wasn't even his property. And he said, I would think he was looking out for the elderly lady that lived there. And I forget what the third one was, but there were only 3 times. But that was sort of fun. Gee, I can forget about that. Okay. You've heard about the committee that we started. We actually started out with the idea of an arboretum for ornamentals. And very quickly we decided that wasn't going to work because, number one, most people don't know how to spell arboretum. There are all sorts of ways of doing that. And, the other question is, well, why do we need another arboretum? And so very quickly it thought, well, we went to a botanic garden. And, of course, the third question is, where are we going to put it? And you've heard about all of that. Okay, I'm good. I'm glad I'm able to go through a lot of these things. Early on, my first experience with this particular property was in about 1969. One of our first class of students we have a senior thesis project, and he did a senior thesis project on Tibbs Run Reservoir for a recreation facility. And I remember being out here in January looking over the site with him, and so that was my introduction to this, and it's grown from there in many different ways. But when there was you heard about the mob and being involved with the wanting to timber and that sort of thing. Milt Cohn, how many of you heard of Milt Cohn? Okay, he was one that was at city council, and he was the ears of the people, really. Drove the council members nuts. But he called me one evening, and he said, are you aware that that mob has put together a proposal to timber Tibbs Run Reservoir? And I said, no, I hadn't heard about that. And I asked him, have you ever been there? He said, no, I haven't. I said, well, I was planning on taking my class there tomorrow morning. Would you like to come and join us and see what it's like? And so he did, and before class I went and mimeographed a bunch of announcements. When we got here, the students, we were all in cars, and I said a handful to each of the students' cars. I said, you go that way, you go that way, you go that way. Put them in newspaper boxes. You can't put them in mailboxes, but make sure people get this announcement about the meeting in City Council tonight about the Tibbs Run Reservoir. And that night, council was packed with a bunch of people that were irate because they hadn't heard about it. Anyway, and you know the rest of the story, so I don't have to go into that. And when we did the things with the Tibbs Run Coalition, and they did their, we put together a report that was about an inch thick. They had done a survey of all the plants, ecology, geology, soils, et cetera, et cetera. And they got together with all this and they said, well, you know, we've got all this good stuff, but what are we going to propose to do with it? And I said, well, I've got this organization that's been looking for a place to do this, and it's called the West Virginia Botanic Garden. Maybe we could make a botanic garden. And they said, sold. We took it to City Council, and they said, that's wonderful. And you know the rest of the story. Anyway, let's see. Did that. Oh, one of the other things we did, and I don't think she's here, but we did early on, Susan Berry sponsored a competition for a logo for the Botanic Garden. And Irma Barazzoni was the one that won that competition. She isn't here, is she? I'm hoping she'd be here. And she won that competition, and it really nicely combined the symbolism of nature and the curved leaves of the curves of the leaf, and also man's influence with the straight lines on the sides of it. You'll see that same logo on the entrance sign up here that was made by that gal in the green shirt several times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a rework.
She'd done a great job with that, and anyway, I'm just about done. Early on, as we got going, of course, I had to be both president and executive director, and very soon it got to be too much, and so John Weems took over as the second president of the board of directors, and it wasn't sometime after that, he said, you know, you're going to have to retire to get this thing off the ground. Well, I couldn't retire as quickly as I wanted because I had a daughter that I had to get through college. And our afterthought that came in 20 years after. And so I retired in 2005 and was able to put full time into this. One other thing I wanted to mention was early on we had garden tours. We felt a need for education of people. We really didn't have enough here to show people, and so we did a variety of garden tours in different people's yards, different places around town, and lots of people here were involved in those, and that's where we learned about the milk that you heard about in the song. Anyway, now if anybody wants to know, I'll tell you more details. And the other one is Dave Seville. I wish he were here. It's his birthday today, by the way.
My birthday too.
Huh?
My birthday too.
Your birthday too. Wonderful. Happy birthday. But Dave Seville we did a series of garden parties that he worked with the West Virginia Highlands Conservancy, and it was sort of a combination between the Conservancy and the Botanic Garden, and we had them at where he was living. And that was great support, and got a lot of people interested as well. And, you know, and a lot of those things now have come back to things that are doing here. Now we have a good place to do them. Again, I want to thank everyone here. And I think I see lots of faces here, but rather than embarrassing people by saying, who hasn't volunteered here? I want everybody who has volunteered and done some work here as a volunteer to raise your hand. I see the vast majority of the hands in the air here. And that is without a cadre of volunteers. And I want also any present or past board members, raise your hands. Because you all deserve a lot of credit in keeping this thing going and developing. It's super. Thank you all, and let's go have some refreshments. And